In this section, we're going to look at the near demise of Darwin's and Wallace's theory of natural selection and how it became resurrected as new Darwinism. The theory had a problem. It lacked an important ingredient. Darwin had famously written that any variation which is not inherited is unimportant. But at the same time, nobody understood how inheritance would work. So Darwin came up with the provisional idea of a pangenesis. He took the idea from Herbert Spencer that there are physiological units within the cell, the so-called gemellus idea, that now would carry the information, the inheritance information, and that would be thrown off by cells in the body. It would be combined in the egg and then passed on to the embryo. But there were two major problems with this. The first one is it assumed a blending of traits. So information from both parents would be combined and blended. Obviously, if you think this through, over time, through the continuous blending of traits, there should be no variation left. So one of the cornerstones of his theory over time should disappear. Secondly, Darwin also allowed for the possibility, which is a Lamarckian idea, that traits that you acquire during your lifetime, so something that you learn during your lifetime, can be passed on in these little gemmules into the egg and then passed on to the embryo. So acquired traits would be passed on biologically, and obviously that also was problematic. So biologists started looking at these ideas and started slowly to discard natural selection as a plausible theory of evolution. Theologists also went on attack. There were still all these debates on the question of how old planet Earth actually was. And there were calculations, today we know they were incorrect, but nevertheless calculations at that time that suggested that our planet is not old enough to allow for random variation to take place and to lead to such complex organisms like humans, because random variation takes time. And the argument was, because the Earth is not old enough, it can't be random. There has to be some other mechanism. So the idea of natural selection slowly became less and less important and convincing. And it's really ironic that somebody by the name of Gregor Mendel came to the rescue. Mendel was a friar. He was a German-speaking person in what is now the Czech Republic. He was relatively poor, and in order to gain education, because he loved studying, he became a monk. And his superiors charged him with the task of doing experiments in the experimental cloister gardens. So he started playing around with pea plants. So pea plants have different colors of their flowers, different shapes and sizes of the actual peas. So he started interbreeding these different plants, and he started noticing some patterns. And it is ironic because Mendel started the experiments to explicitly prove Darwin wrong. He had read the German um, version of The Origin of the Species. They had discussed it with groups of other people in back then the Czech, or in the circles that he was working with, and he was convinced that his pea experiments with the observations that he made there would prove the theory wrong. So in 1865 he first talked about his observations, and in 1866 he officially published it as translated experiments in the hybridization of plants. So it was published in a German scientific journal, And he described two important laws there, the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. You probably have covered them in your high school biology classes, but just a quick recap. So any kind of information, genetic information, is being copied on two different alleles, two different versions of the genetic information. And each individual receives one copy from the parents, from the two parents. And depending on whether that information is dominant, is going to be expressed, or is recessive, so it is not dominantly expressed, will determine what kind of trait is actually phenotypically be displayed. So often, if we take, for example, here the color of the flower, like um, capital letter means the trait is dominant, so it will be expressed. A small letter means it is recessive, so it will only be expressed if combined with another recessive allele. So this is also where the idea of homozygotes, so where you have two alleles with the same information come in, and you have heterozygotes where you have two alleles with different information. And as you can see here, even though you have two different colors in the parent generation, because one of the alleles is recessive, the other one is dominant, in the first generation all of them will resemble the dominant, or will express the dominant gene version of the gene, and then in the second generation we will see with some regularity some white flowers reappear. So this is the law of segregation that can explain why there is discrete information, this is important here, that is not being blended and then leads to the passing on of information over generations. And the second law that is really important here is the law of independent assortment. Here the idea is that all these genes are passed on individually. So there are genes that encode, for example, the color of the pea, the shape of the pea, is it wrinkled, is it round, etc., etc. And so through the combinations of dominant and recessive genes that independently code for these traits, you can have new hybrids that show combinations that were not there in the parent generation. But the important point again is it is discrete pieces of information that are being passed on over generations. So Mendel, he published his work. People did not really take notice of it, and he also soon became promoted and he was put in charge of that monastery where he was working. And when he died with 61 years, nobody really remembered his contributions, and it would take about 40 odd years for people to rediscover his writings. And then there was a lot of debate at that time because people had caught up on the idea of mutations, and biologists started thinking about this, and people really were puzzled. How could this idea be recombined with the idea of variation within the concept of natural selection? And it's this gentleman, Ronald Fisher, who was a mathematical genius. He was interested in biology, but he approached biological questions through mathematical lenses. So he single-handedly invented what we now call statistics. So if you ever suffered with any kind of statistical test, there's a good chance that this gentleman was kind of responsible for it. And he showed that it is possible, if you have lots of independent genes that encode information that are being passed on over generations, you can create this continuous variation that Darwin had described. So if you have lots of genes involved in the expression of a trait and they independently are being passed on, you get these normal curves that are central to Darwinian selection. So that was a very important insight, and a mathematical proof that it is possible to combine the laws by Mendel with the idea of variation that Darwin talked about. We will come back to Fisher at some stage as well, because unfortunately he is also very strongly associated with the eugenics movement. So he was a brilliant mathematician, a brilliant biologist, but he also was very firm in his ideological beliefs of race and the superiority of certain races over others. And this really led to a lot of pain and suffering over the next couple of years. But his contribution in 1918 was essentially the starting point of what is called the modern synthesis. So he also had other important insights. He very clearly showed that selection works at the population level. And here I will quickly give an overview of 3 different types of selection that have been described. The first one, and the one that most of us are probably intuitively aware of, is directional selection. So taking the idea of the giraffe again, so Lamarck's idea, giraffes vary in their neck length, and those giraffes that are able to reach the leaves of trees that are taller, they have an advantage over other giraffes that are shorter, because they will not be as likely to get all those nutritious, very flavorsome leaves from higher up in the tree. All right, so those giraffes that have longer necks are more likely to survive. They have better access to scarce resources, so therefore they can pass on their traits. And those that are equipped with shorter necks don't survive. They're dead. So in the next generation now, we have a slight shift in the distribution. So now, instead of a meter, we have necks that are 1 meter and 20 centimeters. And again, the same mechanism works. Those that have longer necks, so they are able to better reach those higher up branches with the more nutritious leaves, are able to survive, pass on their genes. Those with shorter necks can't pass on their genes, that, and we have another shift in the distribution. So now the average neck is 1.4 meters. And this continues. Those with longer necks can pass on their genes, those with shorter necks die. And over time, we see this shift from an average neck length of about 1 meter to, over 4 generations, a neck length of about 1.6 meters. So this is directional selection, where the selection is really working at one end of the distribution and gives the individuals an advantage over individuals at the opposite end of the distribution. A second one is balancing selection. Balancing selection can be explained using this example of the moths. So let's assume there are moths that vary in color gradients, so the pigmentation. So there's some that are quite white, and there's some that are relatively black, and there's some that are gray. So now imagine those moths live in an environment that is heavily polluted. So trees have a gray, grayish bark, and those moths that have gray pigmentation are less likely to be spotted by predators, and therefore can pass on their genes. So those white moths and those black moths, they stick out, and therefore they're more likely to be eaten. Hence, the ones in the middle, the poor gray ones, can have babies, and the white and the black ones are being eaten. So in the next generation, what will now happen is we still have the gray ones in the middle, but the extreme white ones have been eaten. So there's there are fewer individuals with the more whitish genes, variations of the gene, and there are fewer individuals with the darker version of this particular gene. So again, we have selection at each end of the distribution, and only those in the middle have a better chance to escape predators. And so over time, we have a population that becomes more and more gray overall. So here what is happening, the selection is working at both ends of the distribution, at both extreme ends, and maintains a specific trait stable in a population. The third one is a so-called disruptive selection. What happens here is, we could use the example of the Darwin finches. If we have a finch that has an average kind of beak size, this is the most common type, but then living in a very tough and scarce environment, finches that have a slightly thinner beak here are better able to extract, for example, insects from tree bark, or like from little holes in the ground. And on the other hand, those with slightly sturdier beaks are better able to crack nuts or hard seeds, right? So in this harsh environment now, the individuals at the extreme ends have a slight advantage over those individuals in the middle of the distribution. So the ones in the middle have struggle finding enough food, so they're more likely to die, and those at the extreme ends, because they have beaks that allow them to get access to specialized resources, are more likely to pass on their genes. So in the next generation now, we start to see some kind of divergence. So there are slightly more individuals that have these thin beaks and slightly more individuals that have those thick, sturdy beaks, and the center of the distribution becomes a little bit smaller. Again, the same selection pressure works. Those with the stronger beaks are more likely to find seeds, can pass on their genes. Those with thinner beaks, more likely to find little insects, can pass on their genes. The ones in the middle, they're not really well adapted to either one of the two food sources, more likely to die. And so over time what we see is a divergence of the two distributions. And essentially what happens here is, over time we will see two different species emerge. So this is also related again now to the species problem. Darwin talked about the origin of species, but he did not engage with the concept of species. What is a species? And it would be this gentleman, Ernst Mayr, a German who had a very long and productive life. He was born in 1904, and he would only pass on in 2005. He, like many of his generation, was supposed to follow family traditions, so he went to Berlin in order to study medicine, but he was more interested in the study of birds, so ornithology, so he switched. He had a professor that promised him a postdoc position and the opportunity to travel and explore birds in faraway places if he would manage to submit his thesis within 16 months. And so at the age of 21, he managed to defend his thesis. He was employed at the Berlin Museum, and his boss basically then allowed him to travel to New Guinea, where he spent a couple of years. And similar to Darwin and Wallace, this experience, the ability to travel and study wildlife in very extreme environments, was really formative. When he returned in 1930, so he returned back to Germany, and it was a relatively unstable time, so when the chance arose to get a job in the US, he jumped on it and he moved over to New York, where he became associated with the Natural History Museum. And it was in the US that he would then make a lot of theoretical contributions to biology and the study of evolution, which would strongly influence the modern synthesis movement. And so one of his contributions was essentially working out the species concept. So using that example of disruptive selection, he argued that a species is a group of individuals within a population that interbreed, and over time or over geographical distance would be unable to interbreed with other animals of other populations. So it's not without debate, this concept, but it helped to make sense of what is actually a species. So he was really important in solving that puzzle that eluded Darwin. He also, so this is the paper where, or the book where he first brought all these ideas together and helped push forward the modern synthesis. He also um, made a lot of other contributions to biology. One that I will briefly mention is the importance of distinguishing different levels of explanation of cause and effect in biology. So he used this thought experiment. Um, he had a house in the US, and he played through this thought experiment that was published in 1961 in the journal Science, of why did this little warbler, this little bird, start his southward migration on that particular night of the 25th of August? What could be possible causes? How could we explain this behavior biologically? And so he argued we have to distinguish between different types of reasons. The first one could be an ecological cause, because the warbler is an insect eater and winter was coming, so there would be lack of food, hence the warbler has to move. Ecological cause. A second one could be genetic. The warbler might have, through evolution, inherited a genetic program that now triggered the bird to react appropriately to a specific environmental stimuli. And because this little warbler has that genetic program imprinted, and another bird that might have been sitting right next to this little warbler, like an owl for example, does not have this genetic program, therefore did not react, but the warbler did because of the genetic inheritance. There are also potential intrinsic physiological causes. So for example, the warbler might be sensitive to the changes in the length of the day, and so this change in the light that is available on that particular day of the 25th of August might have triggered a mechanism in the little brain of the bird that caused that brain to start flying off. There could also be an extrinsic physiological cause. It could be that on that particular day a cold weather spell passed through, and therefore the bird was trying to evade the cold wind and started flying south. So there are different explanations for the same behavior. Which one is right? Which one is wrong? Mayr argued we need to look at all of them. And he also argued we have to think about, like the ultimate causes and the proximal causes. Like what is responsible for a specific behavior. So ultimate causes are ecological and genetic causes, which are linked to distal explanations involving evolutionary timescales. And proximal causes are triggers that are embedded within the environment or within the physiological system of an animal that would cause a specific behavior. So Mayr was really important. Mayr was really adamant that biologists have to study both types of explanations, but have to be careful which one they are talking about. So quite often, and this is still an issue, especially if we think about psychology, people start mixing up ultimate causes and proximal causes. So behavior in any kind of behavior can be explained through a specific situational trigger, a situational feature that causes an individual to react. But we can also study the same behavior through an ultimate and distal explanation, or distal cause explanation. So both explanations are possible. They don't substitute each other, but they complement each other. And this is really important if we think about psychology and human behavior, because we can study, as we typically do, behavior through proximal level explanations. So this is what we typically do in psychology, but it's also possible to study the same behavior through a long-term perspective, so an ultimate level explanation. And this is what evolutionary explanations are often about. So a really important distinction that Mayr contributed to biology. Another person we have to talk about is Dobzhansky. He's famous for this quote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He was also a migrant to the US, and he, just to show you the diversity of methods that biologists started to adopt during that time, he started studying these little fruit flies in the lab and looking at the genetics of these fruit flies to see what this could tell us about natural selection. So, for example, he wrote this important book in 1937 in which he summarized everything that was known about genetics at that time. So the experimental study of animals like the fruit fly in the lab, and how this could be combined with all the mathematical laws that Fisher had used early on, and then combining all of this, how this could be used to explain the origin of species. Right? So he brings all these ideas back together. He uses natural selection, he uses these mathematical models that Fisher championed at the beginning of the 20th century, and he then brings it together with experimental evidence on genes coming from the lab. Another person that we have to quickly mention here is Julian Huxley. He is actually the grandson of Darwin's bulldog, and he coined the name the modern synthesis. Right? So it's these three individuals in particular. There are a whole lot of other researchers, but these three individuals I just want to quickly highlight that brought together these divergent ideas, streams of evidence, and helped to solve a lot of the problems that evaded Darwin. So this is what the modern synthesis is all about. On one hand, we have variation. This was in particular the contribution by Wallace to the theory. We have the idea of competition. So this is Malthus's idea, like with increasing population growth and the limited resources, so the struggle for survival. And we have the idea of inheritance, the idea that Darwin got especially from animal breeders. And this together was the Darwin-Wallace theory of natural selection. People in biology also started discovering the idea of mutation, so small changes in individual characteristics, round about the time when Darwin was living and working. But it was only through the rediscovery of the laws of inheritance according to Mendel and Fisher's work that would show that lots of genes working independently could bring about this continuing variation that natural selection needs to work. Right? So bringing all these ideas together from the 19th century, so the ideas of Darwin and Wallace, with ideas from the early part of the 20th century, the rediscovery of Mendel's work, the recombination with the emerging insights from genes, would lead to this modern synthesis. So the idea that natural selection works through genes is something that only really came together in the 1930s and 1940s. And this also explains why then people started ignoring other types of inheritance that are particularly important if we talk about humans, like culture, have really been left unexplored. So as you can imagine, biologists were mainly interested in animals, and back then the assumption was that animals don't have culture, so biologists were feeling free to ignore all this potential all these potential information systems like culture that could be important. And within psychology, Darwinian ideas had been largely discredited. And so it would take another couple of decades before people started re-investigating the idea that potentially first of all, it is possible to use biological ideas like natural selection, the modern synthesis, to explain human behavior, and start thinking about other inheritance mechanisms that Darwin has alluded to in very implicitly, for example, through his pangenesis idea, that maybe there's information that is acquired from other individuals through the lifetime of the individual, and then being passed on, and becomes an important piece of information. And this will be something that we will explore in the coming modules.